before I introduce our speakers, we actually have a polling question just to get a sense from you about this topic. So whip out your devices. I'll try and pad just in case you haven't got that ready. So the polling question, if you go into Plenary 4 in the conference program and enter your response, does your fund really understand member needs in post-retirement? Yes, no, or I'm unsure. Wow. The race is on. And what it looks like is that we have a bit of a fence-sitting audience. But marginally, is that it? Oh, you just pipped it. No, so that actually justifies our session today. Oh, look, even more so. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Deborah, and would you please join me in making her feel welcome?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about the latest ACFS AIST research project. This particular piece of research was commissioned late last year, not long after the FSI, and we were really interested to look at what's the experience of average retirees and what does this suggestion that trustees should be looking at a default in retirement, what does it really look like? And I should thank the people who came to this session at CMSF earlier this year, because we ran a couple of our preliminary findings through that group and got some terrific feedback. And in fact, in that session, we looked at Susan and Martin, two typical retirees. And we chose these balances. We looked at people who are retiring on a single woman retiring on 100,000 and a man retiring on 250, because that's not too far away from the average retirement balance. It's a fairly typical retiree. In those cases, both of them were homeowners, and we know that 80% of people when they retire are, own homes. And further, we also added a couple because we know that around 65% of people who, when they retire, are in a relationship. So we wanted to know what their experience would be like. And we also threw in a woman on 100,000 who's not a homeowner, and we looked at two people who were retiring on a balance of 500,000, one of whom had an adverse health effect. And we wanted to see how their experience ran, given the requirement to generate a retirement income, which balances the priorities of adequacy in retirement, risk management, inflation, market and longevity risk, and also balancing the flexibility to access capital. What does that mean in terms of retirement income? And of course, for our retirees, in fact all of our retirees, we considered only their home ownership, their eligibility for the pension and their account-based pension. In the earlier version we presented to CMSF, we tried to factor in other assets outside of the home and super, but it's incredibly variable and there's no reliable data. So we're just sticking to those assets for the time being. So as you know, there is something of a trade-off between managing risk and also flexibility to access capital. Quite often when we think about risk management, particularly longevity risk management, inflation risk management, we think about annuities. When we think about flexibility, we're inclined to think more about account-based pensions. And there is something of a trade-off. You could have a lot of flexibility but not manage your risk, or vice versa. In terms of the experience of our retirees, and I'm very glad that Nick said the report is available, because there's very detailed modelling for each group, each of the 6 cohorts that I mentioned in today's dollar terms. We found that really for the first couple of cohorts, those on 100,000 or on 250,000, or indeed the couple who had combined superannuation balance of 350,000, that really the account-based pension proved to be the best choice for them, in that on those relatively low balances they would be eligible either for the full pension if they were on 100,000 or for a part pension on slightly higher balances. And it's the combination of pension income and account-based pension income that gives them their income stream in retirement. The factor of the age pension is that it provides a very good form of longevity risk management. And the fact that those people also have superannuation balances, they provide a supplement to their age pension. So as you know, in the FSI, the statement was made exactly what is the objective of superannuation. And I would agree that it is about providing a solid retirement income and also about either supplementing or replacing the pension. So that's the view we've taken. For those on higher superannuation balances, they probably get a better outcome through incorporating a form of longevity risk for those who have relatively little pension income, say a quarter annuity and 75% account-based pension, was shown by us to have the best outcome in terms of allowing them to enjoy an adequate income, but also provide some risk management for them. And I'm watching the countdown of minutes here, so I can't tell you too much about each case at this time. The third thing that I really want to make a point about is that in the first run-through that we presented to CMSF, we assumed that everyone would do the minimum drawdown. What we found was that in the earlier years of retirement, particularly from 65 to around about 72 to 75, the level of income that afforded a retiree, the pension and the account-based, the age pension and their account-based pension income did not really reach an adequate income. So we looked at drawdown strategies, but it also meant that they accumulated quite large totals towards the end of their lifetime. And since it's really there to afford an adequate income, we played with the drawdown and we arrived at a drawdown which was more like choosing the ASFA modest standard plus 5% of their superannuation balance each year. Now, you'll immediately recognise that there is an element of capital depletion in that. Yet if you have a look at our modelling, you'll see that going out towards the age of 90, there's still a significant balance there. It's very interesting how we guide members about their drawdown. For our candidate who was a non-homeowner, and about 20% of people are not homeowners, the pension allows about $3,600 rent assistance each year, which turns out to be about $70 per week. And that will depend on where you live, but it's not very much. Looking at ABS statistics, we think the amount you need for rental is closer to about, I think it's $9,000, which allows you about $170 a week, which is not particularly flush. But what that means is for the non-home owner, their adequate standard of living needs to be higher. They need to draw down more. And that's something important to think about as we see cohorts coming through who may not have the same extent of home ownership as retirees currently enjoy. We also looked at our candidate who had an adverse health impact at age 80. The fact that he had 75% of his income as an account-based pension meant there was a lump sum to draw on, and he had that flexibility to access his capital. In the recent Productivity Commission report that came out on retirement period, they made the point that identifying a default for retirees is really difficult. Retirees are not a homogenous group. They all have different wealth profiles, they have different expectations of life, and they've had a different experience in the earning environment as well. So understanding the needs of retirees is really quite a challenge, and it's really unlikely that one size would fit all. So what we're concluding here is that for trustees, understanding your demographics is really important. It may be that if you have an open offer fund with a whole range of experience, you need more than one default, more than one SIPPer. If you have a fund that's primarily low balance retirees, your result will be quite different than if you are a fund with high average balances. The key things that we really have noticed, and I think there's been a considerable change in the industry in the last year, is the importance of putting things in a consumption frame, indicating clearly to members what their retirement savings are likely to mean in terms of their weekly income when they retire. Also, advising members on drawdown is incredibly important, and I think what becomes clear is that the latest research is really showing that members trust their funds incredibly. They're not in a default in accumulation because they don't care. It's because they're trusting their fund to identify the best outcome for them. And there is a high degree of trust, and people are looking to their funds to give them guidance in retirement. So giving them guidance in terms of what's an appropriate balance for them in terms of their income stream, and what are the appropriate drawdowns for them and their personal circumstances is going to be challenging because it's about customising and personalising the message. But the indications that I see coming through are very strongly that I think given the change, and one of my other roles is to do with digital innovation, I see that coming through. The low cost of innovation is really allowing for us to customise far more than has been the case in the past. And I can see Mike Scully there, and he reminds me that my last statement from UniSuper came through as a little animated video telling me how much I'm likely to get in retirement. That kind of message really stimulates financial literacy. People understand how important then it is to contribute, and it also means that it has meaning and guidance to people about that very important point of preparing for retirement. I've got a whole minute left. But I'll leave that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Don't forget you can submit your questions and comments and compliments through the AXA Investment Management live Q&A, and you can do that throughout, and I'll be noting them down, and they can form part of our final Q&A section of this workshop. I'll hand over now to Richard Picker for our second speaker.
Good afternoon. How's everyone feeling? Normally these late afternoon sessions are the toughest because everyone's ready to, what do they call it? Hitting their 3:30 itis or something. So probably one of the more challenging slots. But today I'm going to take you through some really interesting findings we've done from a broad survey of Australian consumers. We surveyed over 6,500 Australians aged 40 plus at the end of last year, and we spoke to them about everything you guys might want to find out in relation to their retirement. Now, the key thing to be cognizant of right now is that for this segment, or in fact for all Australians, more and more of them are becoming concerned in relation to having enough for retirement, okay? So each year we turn to them and we say, what are your worries in relation to retirement? And what we find is that since 2011, every year, more and more people have been saying they are worried about retirement, and they have been citing a wider range of factors that they're worried about. We also have some preliminary 2015 results, and we can see that this trend has continued. People are becoming more concerned. So we're really interested in finding out what are they worried about? What are the key things that keep them up at night? And the main thing which comes through right now is retirement adequacy. Okay, so most people, 3/4 of Australians aged 40 plus and not yet retired, they're worried about having enough to get by once they retire and also outliving their retirement savings. There's huge concerns around outliving retirement savings. After this, the next set of concerns tends to be around rising costs. Okay, people are worried that inflation and so on will erode away their hard-earned wealth. They're worried about potential aged care costs in the future and not having enough for that. They're worried about potential medical costs in the future and not having enough for that. So many Australians are concerned about rising costs, and they're also really worried that the government's going to come around and tamper with superannuation and dip into their hard-earned savings as well. So that's what people's top concerns are, but the main one which comes through in the study is outliving their retirement savings. So we've actually done quite a bit of analysis to quantify the size of the retirement shortfall, okay? Now, if you look at the typical pre-retiree and ask them when they expect to retire, on average they'll say around the age of 64, okay? Now, what we did is we went in our sample and we found all of those people currently age 64, and we looked at their wealth situation, okay? People who are 64 years old, currently not yet retired, and on average they have about $370,000 in wealth, okay? This excludes their property, so discretionary investment wealth. So $370,000, but that's pulled up by some very large balances. As you know, averages tend to be skewed by higher balances. The median is quite a bit lower. The median balance at 64 is $130,000, which isn't fantastic. But this is the situation at the moment. That's what the typical 64-year-old looks like, or the median 64-year-old looks like. Then what we did is we wanted to work out when they're going to pass away, but we couldn't ask in an online survey, when do you think you're going to kick the bucket? So we just said, how long do you expect to spend in retirement? And the average person out there believes that they'll spend about 20 years in retirement, or a quarter of their life. That's quite a significant amount of time spent in retirement. But again, the averages hide some interesting facts. If you look at the results in more detail, you'll find that 29% expect to live past the age of 90, and that includes 9% who expect to live past the age of 100. Okay, so I've tried to work out, what their diets are and so on to see what gets them to expect to live so long. But overall, there's the potential for big longevity issues, right? Especially when you consider the fact that the typical person not yet retired thinks that their savings will only last 15 years into their retirement. Okay, that gives us a funding gap of about 5 years. We turned to these lovely people and we said, all right, how much do you think you'll need each year to have a comfortable retirement? And on average, they said about $47,000 per annum. Okay, so want to have a fairly expensive lifestyle. And because of that funding gap, you can see that if the age pension is about $17,000 at the time, the typical person will have a shortfall of about $30,000 per annum. Okay, so based on what they're expecting, there's a bit of a funding gap. Now, the thing is, the picture is not all that bleak for 20% of Australians. 20% of Australians, or 18% to be precise, are expecting that their savings will outlast them. Okay, they'll have a little bit left to hand over to their kids and so on. So roughly a fifth will be fine. There's a further 31% of Australians who feel that they'll run out of funds right around the time they pass away. So essentially, their last check is going to be to the undertaker, and it's going to bounce, right? So that's, essentially, if you guys are investing in undertakers, I don't know what their businesses are called, but don't, okay? Because 30% of their clients are going to not pay. And then you have, sorry, the clicker's playing up. And then you have the remaining half of Australians who essentially will outlive their savings. Okay, so this is the group who is the most important because, they're going to need the most help. And there's a bit of good news. The good news is that the typical Australian who expects to outlast their savings currently has 12 years to do something about it, on average. Okay, so it's not too late. On average, 12 years is a long time, so a lot of room for, super fund trustees and product providers to educate their clients and members, to give them the right products to ensure that they achieve their goals. And another, just to highlight the education gap, we always find that the more informed someone feels about their needs around retirement, the more comfortable they tend to be as well. For example, if you look at the typical retiree right now who says, I'm having a very, very comfortable lifestyle, On average, if they're a couple, they're living off about $43,000 per annum. If they're single, they're living off $28,000 per annum, okay? If you look at those who are one level down, so they say I can afford the basics and I also have some left over for extras so I can go eat out and go to the movies, they're spending on average $5,000 to $10,000 less per annum. So, you know, retirement isn't as costly as people expect. It's just important to communicate this and set the expectations and so on. Now, everyone here, though, I suspect is really interested in products. So what we did is we turned to all these people and we said, all right, think about the ideal retirement income product. What do you want from it? And the main thing that resonates with people, or essentially the prerequisite you have to have, is that the product has to be simple, so it has to be easy to understand, tax effective and low cost. They're kind of the same thing, right? Like competitively priced or effective for them. And also from a financially stable provider. They want to know that the provider will be around in 20, 30 years time or 40 years time, depending on how long they live. So that's essentially a prerequisite. You have to make sure you're ticking these boxes, otherwise it's going to be really hard to get people interested. After this, it's about wealth preservation, okay? People have worked very, very hard at ensuring that they grow their capital value, so they want to be able to protect the capital, the income payments. And what really comes through strongly here is that Australians really are attracted to products that helps ensure that income lasts for however long they live. Okay, so longevity, we saw in the beginning, it's a big concern. People are very worried about outliving their retirement savings. So it's not surprising to see that so many people out there are saying that I want my ideal product ensures that my income lasts however long I live. Okay, so that's very, very, very important. And then the next set of important factors is accessibility. For example, being linked to your bank account so that you can go to ATM and draw the funds whenever you like. And also people like high returns. But what's really interesting is high returns is fairly low on the list. The main thing, if you get them to pick one option from the list we give them, this single option that income or retirement income product has to have, what always comes through is income lasts however long I live. Okay, that's the thing which resonates the most with people. In fact, it's such a powerful feature for products to have that it will actually get people to change their super funds for it. Now, in our survey, we had 2/3 of Australians saying that when they move from super to pension, they plan to stay with the same fund, okay? They're super loyal, they're happy with their fund. When they move from super to pension phase, they're happy to stay, okay? And if you ask these people, what will get you to switch to another fund, 1/3 of them actually said, I would move if that fund could guarantee an amount I can withdraw for the rest of my life. Okay, so that's how important such a feature is. It will actually help not only with acquisition and, well, it will help with acquisition, it will help with retention, it will help with making sure that your members' worries are addressed as well. That's what people are really after right now. I do have one more minute, which gets me onto our bonus slide. And I know how excited you guys are about, these My Pension and default pension option products, so I thought I'll make this the sexy ending slide. But we also turned to Australians and we gauged their appetite for a default pension option, okay? We said, think about something, well, essentially, something that automatically invests your money once you hit retirement. And what you'll find is that the bigger the super fund balance is, the more control people want to have. This is not a surprise, right? If you look at those with $500,000 or more in their super account, 3/4 of them say that they want to be involved or they want their advisor to be involved in picking the right pension product for them and making the right decision with their pension monies. But what you'll find is that a default option is actually quite attractive or appropriate if you have a lot of lower balance members, because lower balance members, what we find is that they're quite ambivalent when it comes to what happens with their superannuation savings. They essentially haven't thought about it. They say that they don't know what they'll do, or I'm happy for someone else to make the decision. So where you have a lot of lower balance members, that's where a default product is most attractive. Okay, and that's it. That's time. So thank you very much.
I'll hand over now to Simon Fox.
Right, good afternoon everyone. As Nick suggested, I'm going to try and give a bit more of an international flavour to the topic, partly from my experience in the UK, but also from our global client base. I'm very conscious that I am now the last session before you get to finish for the day, so I want to keep it very simple and give you three general observations. The first of these is that we're seeing increasing freedom for people in retirement, increasing flexibility and control over retirement pots. In many ways, in some countries, that process of change and evolution is catching up with a lot of what you see already in Australia. But whilst there's a trend towards greater financial flexibility, there's a consensus that savers still need investment support. Moreover, there's clear value in providing those investment solutions to do it with simplicity and in a way that is very understandable. So let's pick up each of these in turn. My first observation was that savers are getting greater freedom to control and to manage their long-term savings. In many respects, it's coming from two sources. The first is regulatory changes, and the second is technological change. I think we've only just started to see the potential impact of technology on both the investment industry, in which I work, and the broader pension industry as well. The ability that it can provide to provide more accessibility and more simplicity for investors is clearly very significant. At this stage in time, though, at the very least, it's already had an impact on the way that we expect to be able to live our lives. The control and understanding of every aspect of what we do, leading through from technology, is already influencing the way we look to our pension savings. And I think because of that, at the very least, we're seeing changes from a regulatory perspective as well. The latest iteration comes from the UK, where we've seen the shift to having no requirement for an annuity. This is likely to have a significant impact in the UK market. It's going to change things in the way that potentially you've already seen here in Australia. To a large extent, it's been seen as a response to low annuity rates in the UK, particularly as a result of QE, both in the UK and the US. Low rates have clearly made annuities far less attractive for investors. But actually, I think it's much bigger than that. It acknowledges that the life for most people doesn't stop at retirement. So rather than forcing people to de-risk their portfolios in their late 50s and 60s into cash and government bonds, the changes that we've undertaken in the UK is now allowing us to think about what is the most appropriate way to invest money throughout someone's life, and to be able to give them the option to retain some growth through into the later years. I think the other big change, removing this obligation, is enabling us to think also about different members. And we've just heard about the different size that some members will have in their investment pots. For some, it is a small top-up. For others, it's a larger, more material amount. The different types of objectives that members will have, what they're trying to achieve, will affect how they should then be allocating through retirement. And the changes that we've introduced in the UK will allow more flexibility and control to achieve that. But these changes do come with challenges. As you increase the flexibility that people have in retirement, it also means they have to make more choices. We think there's going to be more product innovation in the UK on the back of the changes that we've introduced, and we're seeing it globally as well. In fact, all of this leads on to really the second observation, that members still want investment support. One school of thought has historically been that we should empower members. We should give them a range of investment choices, a long list of things that they can choose from. It's their money. They should be the ones that choose where and how to invest that. To some extent, that argument, which was very strong 10 years ago, has proved to be weaker over the last few years. We see a consensus shift to people wanting to help their members more and more. And increasingly, we understand that members value and favour that sort of assistance. Just looking at some of the statistics that we've seen in terms of members choosing default options pre-retirement, The example I've put on the screen is very representative of a UK DC arrangement. This reflects First Group, and when they introduced their new scheme a few years ago, all but one of the original 8,000 new members elected to go into the default fund. That's 99.9875% of members. And that choice, that decision to go into a default fund is true across industries. It's even true in the investment space as well. If you look at asset manager take-up of default options, it's also incredibly high. And in many respects, it's very logical. We are meant to be the experts, us in the investment side and you in terms of the funds. We're meant to be the experts from an investment perspective. Individual members will struggle to be able to make many of the choices and understand the complexities that are there. And to the extent that we can help solve those problems and address them, then clearly that's going to be advantageous. Indeed, studies in the US have borne out the suggestion that default funds and solutions provide better returns than self-selecting options. I want to return very quickly to technology. This is from a study by KPMG on global megatrends. It highlights the extent to which we use the internet today. The growth in information available to us is staggering. But the response that we then see from consumers is not that they welcome increased amounts of choice, it's that they value transparency and simplicity of solutions to capture it. To some extent, that leads on to my third observation. There's value in simplicity and understandability. I have another tech reference for you. The strength of Apple has been built around 3 core products. They may continue to innovate, they may continue to enhance and improve each of them, but ultimately, they have the 3 key products. They're not trying to create alternatives or permutations around them. The iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad are ubiquitous. One thing that you don't have when you go to Apple is a choice about having more processing power for less battery life, or to have more memory for a lighter model. They're building what they believe to be are the best solutions and the best products, and that can carry through from an investment perspective as well. Let's look at the range of different asset classes that are available to members today, not just your traditional equities and bonds, not just domestic equities and bonds either, global investments spanning through to alternative asset classes, exotic credit, exotic bonds, and many others. The range of asset classes that are available to us today and to members today is huge, but we can't expect individual members to be able to understand them all. Again, the evidence is that without support, members who select their own funds will do so in a very undiversified way. So we think that the argument is there for trying to simplify the solutions for investors, and that leads us to 3 core types of strategy that you might want to look at. Certainty strategies, maybe it's annuities, maybe it's cash, growth strategies, and income strategies. A simpler way of trying to repackage the different options that are available. Note that my buckets there reflected outcomes, not asset classes. The evidence is that members, individual savers, don't understand asset classes. However much we try and explain what an equity is and what a bond is, they certainly will struggle with some of the alternative asset classes. So one of the key changes in terms of simplicity and understandability is moving to outcome-orientated solutions. That's the third big trend that we've seen, particularly in the UK over the last few years, but increasingly globally as well. Multi-asset funds are being pulled through to try and provide outcome-orientated solutions, not beat peer groups or beat benchmarks. And with that, we also have greater freedom to access alternative asset classes and also active management. So how do I put all this together? I think the best way in terms of helping members in retirement is to empower them. But the way that the world is moving is to empower them through financial freedom, accessibility, control, and flexibility of their retirement pots. Part of the solution from an asset management perspective is to help solve some of the investment issues and providing quality, understandable, and clear solutions to try and bridge the gaps that members face. Thank you.
So just a reminder, you can rate this session via the conference app. We are going to open up to the floor for questions and answers, and while you're thinking about that, and we do have a roving mic up the back. Hi Lee, thank you. So just raise your hand if you do have a question, but the first one that came through made me laugh because it suggested an alternative polling question that I should have asked you. So maybe we'll do that via a show of hands. We make a lot of assumptions in this area. Has any fund actually asked their members what their post-retirement needs or wants are? So do you actively ask your members? I see a few. Thank you. Second question, following on, Richard, in your findings, what it seems to me is that most members seem to be looking for a cheap, high-income, long-term annuity, if they even exist. How many
Which is simple to understand.
It's simple to understand, but not simple to offer, I wouldn't have thought. How many would ultimately take one up, and what's the sort of comparison with Australia versus global in annuity uptake?
Well, we see it from the Australian consumer perspective, where annuity usage right now is very, very, very small. But the interesting thing is there's only a quarter of Australians age 40 plus who are not interested in using annuities, which means 3/4 are interested or convinced, can be convinced to do so. The main thing is that, while I think it's about 2 or 3% who actually use annuities, there's about a fifth of people who say, I want to use annuities, and then another 30% who say, I want to find out more about them, or I want a financial planner to talk to me about them. So there's definitely a big appetite here, especially considering, past 10, 20 years, it's been fairly niche, but now the rules are changing as well to make them more accessible, and also more advisors recommending annuities, more funds adopting them as an option as well. So we given the demand that we have here, we'd likely to see usage grow quite rapidly.
Any questions from the floor yet? Show of hands. Down the front, thank you.
I'm Antoinette from Vic Super. Just a question about the first two sets of data. I'm wondering if we took out all the women over 40 from that core group and asked them the same questions, whether we would get a different result because of their much more compromised balances and the difficulties they have in building up that creep.
That's a very good question. The main important thing to recognize with women is that they do tend to be behind men financially. Everyone knows this because we always talk about it. But what we find from our research is that because they're always told that they're going to be behind their male peers, they don't do anything about their savings or with their savings. So they're much less likely to make additional contributions. They're much less likely to seek financial advice and so on, because there's this mentality that I'm not going to have enough anyway, so it's not worth it. So it's about making sure there's a perception change as well, where telling them that even if you don't have as much as your male peers, it still actually has a big positive impact on your end income if you do something with your retirement savings, or to save more towards your retirement goals.
Well, I would contend that it isn't that they don't want to, it's that they can't. And on the other side of that, perhaps they're a marketing opportunity for education and for specific products.
Yes, definitely agree that there's a lot of room for additional education in that regard.
Somebody actually also asked what proportion of the cohort still has their adult children living with them.
I'd have to check the results to tell you that.
Simon, an interesting question came through about the fact that the UK has just shifted away from a requirement to having annuities, and yet here a recent financial system review has recommended that we move toward them. So who's right, and why is there a financial system review recommending to us to do the opposite of what the UK have decided to do recently?
Well, so as I said, I think the challenge of forcing people into annuities is that you can't then respond to the needs that they particularly have, that an individual has. I think that there's a different question as to whether that makes annuities bad per se. I still expect annuities will have a role to play in the UK in the future. But the part of the way you address that is to make the annuities more presentable and marketable, and you find a solution to achieve that rather than putting it through from a regulatory perspective. You could easily also argue, certainly at the moment, that annuities are less attractively valued. So they certainly are in the UK. I suspect it's exactly the same here. Less attractively valued than other opportunities. And also, the other challenge is, when should you be forced to take them up, or when should you be encouraged to adopt annuities? And is adopting them at 60, 65 the right time to do it, or maybe it is actually later on in retirement when it's more appropriate? So ultimately, I think that, as I say, the trend that we're seeing in the UK, and we think is consistent, is that you will have more flexibility and control over what you do. Whether annuities should be a bigger part of the Australian market than it is today is a slightly different point, and you can see pros and cons of that.
Up the back here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kathy from GST. Jennifer, with your research, you did mention a number of 80% of homeowners. I was wondering, and then you did reflect that the cohorts coming through might change. Has there been any sort of review of divorce rates and the incidence of that changing, and what home ownership is, the size of mortgages as opposed to being a homeowner or non-homeowner, and also, in relation to the challenges, if you go even younger, that they're not likely to have a home. Have you done research on that?
No, that actually wasn't part of our brief here, but it is very clear for those who work with older people. I think one of the hidden parts that we're not dealing with is the need for long-term rental for older people. It's not a thing that we address well in Australia, and if you consider that home ownership rates are falling as each cohort comes through, it's something that should be addressed quite clearly amongst our group. The individual who was most disadvantaged was our single person, Denise, who didn't own a home. And as I said, the government allows 3,600 rent relief for her, rent assistance, and indeed it's more likely to be costing her about $9,000 per year. So that's another factor to do with retirement and the situation of older people that we haven't addressed. And just on that drawdown, what all the research shows us is that people right across the board tend to draw down only the minimum amount from their superannuation because of a precautionary motive. They're scared they'll run out of money, but also they don't understand the costs that are coming up for them in terms of aged care and health and so forth. I think one of the things that we really need to do is to educate people a little bit more about what income they might expect to get, and I think you can't leave the pension out of that. As I said before, for people on low super balances, the pension is the best form of gold-plated annuity you can name. So leaving that out of the equation is just not realistic. But the other thing, of course, is risk tolerance. And as we talk about whether people want annuities or they don't want annuities, every individual is different. There might be people retiring with $100,000 balance in super who prefer to put it all into an annuity because they're extremely risk averse. So risk tolerance varies from individual to individual, and it could well be that someone, for example, who has that additional cost of rent might feel that way. So it's very difficult to generalise about cohorts of retirees because they have different wealth profiles, they have different access to the pension, they have different risk tolerance, they have a different idea about whether they want to leave a bequest, whether they're prepared to draw on the equity in their homes. It's incredibly variable. So coming to a few basic defaults that will suit your members is important, but guiding them to which one suits them is really even more important.
Just looking around the room, sorry. I guess this one's for the entire panel, and it's not the one on the screen just yet. It's an earlier one that talked about the fact that pensions traditionally were designed at a time when people retired at 65 and then, in your words, conveniently died 3 years later. So with longer life expectancy, what will it take to give dignity to a long retirement?
Well, I think the social safety net of the age pension is incredibly important, and in our projections out for 40 years, it's still a sustainable system. But when we have something like the tax review, I think it's very important to look at transfer payments like pension payments hand in hand with the tax system to make sure you're getting equity and that those who need the social safety net can draw on it, and those who can afford to contribute to their own retirement find ways that they can do it that enjoy a quality of life in retirement. So getting the balance right, I think, is important, but I'm not sure, Simon, in the UK, the cost of the pension with respect to GDP, I think is it up around 14% or something?
That's not a figure I know off the top of my head.
We're less than 3% here. So on an international comparative basis, it's a sustainable system and a very important one to keep in place.
Great. Did you want to make a comment?
I have to confess I missed the question.
Oh, that's
but
fine.
I do want to... there was another question around whether people want to... Well, whether people should be saving more or spending less in retirement, so saving more before retirement or spending less in retirement. So I was thinking
saving
about,
more, spending less in retirement.
So, well, saving more beforehand, right? So I was thinking about that while you were asking the other question, but we did actually turn to retirees, so people who have already retired and 5-10 years into their retirement. We said, if you could start your working life again, what would you do differently? Okay, so 2% said don't get married, 1% said don't get divorced, some said don't have any kids, but the thing which really stands out is I wish I started contributing to my super sooner, and I wish I started saving sooner. So they acknowledge that it's not spending less in retirement thing, it's the saving more before retirement thing.